On this episode of Athletic Training Chat, we have repeat guest Rick Cox, and in this episode, we're continuing to talk about leadership a little bit, but we're focusing on the dichotomy in athletic training. And this stemmed from one of Rick's favorite leaders, Jocko Willink, who wrote a book called The Dichotomy of Leadership, which we'll also have linked up in the show notes and on the webpage for this episode. But really, what we wanted to talk about was just kind of how it's hard to have your foot in both places, saying one thing, doing another, and how you have to basically find balance in order to work through that and the importance of that. And that's where the dichotomy of it all came from. So we just picked a few topics that we have kind of identified in our own careers and kind of talked about them and had some takeaway points. So interesting episode. Hope you enjoy it. Let us know what you think. If you'd like more versions of these as we mix them in with interviews of all the great athletic trainers within the profession. As always, we are powered by Mueller Sports Medicine. Please check them out. Always something new and exciting going on there. New offerings and all the different things that they're doing. Again, if you have ideas or feedback, they want to hear it. They want that real-time information so they can provide better tools for the profession. So please check out Mueller Sports Medicine. And without further ado, enjoy this episode. This episode of Athletic Training Chat, we are on with Rick Cox, who is now a three-time guest, first second timer, first third timer. So there we go. And we are going to be talking about the dichotomy in or of athletic training. And really this kind of came about, in one of those random moments. I jotted it down on a piece of paper because it just hit me. I think I was reading just some of the back and forth on social media about some things, and just remember kind of hearing, having read Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink. I have not read the Dichotomy of Leadership, which we'll let Rick talk about, but just how it's hard to be one or the other, and there has to be some kind of mix in the middle. So I actually had to go as we were setting up for this episode and truly look up the definition of dichotomy. And so that per dictionary.com, I believe, was a division or contrast between two things that are or are represented as being opposed or entirely different. And that took me a minute to kind of sit with it. And so I'm going to let Rick, who, if you follow Rick on social media, is super fan of Jocko, as he's got his shirt on. I saw it earlier. Yeah. Kind of talk about how Jocko has framed it, because he puts a really interesting spin on it from the little I've seen. And then we're going to just jump into some topics and kind of what we've seen, and how we think it could potentially be addressed and or, rectified, if you will, as we get through it. So, Rick.
All right. Thanks, Joel. Thanks for having me on a third time. Always happy to have conversations with you. So yeah, when it comes to the dichotomy of leadership from Jocko, actually, for people that have read Extreme Ownership, the last chapter of Extreme Ownership is on the dichotomy of leadership. And then they had to expand that idea into a whole second book. And they had to follow up on Extreme Ownership with this book, because essentially what they had found was people were going too far with the principles in Extreme Ownership. So for example, we all know Extreme Ownership, personal accountability. This is a good thing, owning everything in your world. And what they found was people were doing that so much that they actually weren't allowing those underneath them to actually have any accountability, because they just tried to take it all because that was what they thought was the correct thing to do. And so it's the same with cover and move, which is, one of the other principles in Extreme Ownership. If you do that too much, and again, you just don't allow others to take responsibility and to help out other people, and you're just trying to be kind of the easy button And I actually it's funny, I had a conversation with one of my athletes recently, about he was he was talking about some leadership issues we had on one of our teams. And, I told him, I think that's what he was doing. He was being the easy button when people weren't stepping up and doing their jobs on the team. He was just kind of the one taking it over. And so I actually gave him my copy of Leadership Strategy and Tactics, which is the one after Dichotomy, and showed him that exact chapter on Don't Be the Easy Button. So I think that, Jocko has an interesting spin on, like, these are good principles, but you have to find that balance, because you can absolutely go too far in either direction.
Yeah, I think that when I looked it up, that was kind of the big takeaway in like two short sentences: is you need to be balanced and you can't default to one thing. Was
Mm-hmm.
kind of what he had said. And I know we were just talking off recording about, he referenced, I'm pretty sure this must be an extreme ownership, since I remember it, like ego in leadership, and that, like, yes, there is a certain aspect of needing an ego because that helps elevate you to that wanting that position and, being able to do that. But also, if your ego runs away from you as a leader, we've seen what happens with that too, where it ultimately kind of brings the whole thing down because it runs unchecked, and that presents a problem.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that you're having a little bit of an ego, like, that gives you that drive to constantly, like, push forward and get better. But again, if you let it run away from you, you end up with a lot of problems by being, you don't have any good leaders that are super egotistical.
Right. Yeah, we've seen some ego get some people in trouble on social media
I would
recently.
agree. Yes.
Uh, some very high profile people who actually taught about leadership and character, if anybody's been following that. Anyway, so kind of jumping into it, we jotted down a bunch of different topics and just kind of where we see, there's two sides of it. I think I understand where both sides are coming from, because I definitely have been on both sides of some of these. And the first one we were going to kind of talk about is, there's a lot of talk, especially with this AT shortage, if you will, which I'll be interested to see if that continues. I don't know if 1 year counts necessarily as a shortage, but we'll see. But that has brought up the compensation conversation, which is always a big topic of conversation. But at the same time, a lot of conversation about embracing the grind, and having worked in a great situation in Division III athletics, where, yes, there was busy times, but we were extremely well staffed when I was there. I know what it's like, but don't know what it is like for everybody, obviously, especially the secondary school ATs, where there is just one of you in most instances. And I still don't know how you all do it, but I respect the heck out of you for doing it, because I don't think I could. But to me, those two things are so intertwined, but also so separate. And it's really hard to say both and be like hard on both of them, like hard lined on both of them.
Right. And I mean, obviously, I think we both agree that I think that, salary is an issue in the profession. But also, you know, we kind of are our own worst enemy at times, because we do embrace that grind culture. And I think a lot of that comes from, so maybe some of the more old school athletic trainers that kind of came up, and you have to get that, you have to work your butt off as a student, and you have to be there all the time, and then you get your internship and you're there 70, 80, 90 hours a week for $10,000 a year. And then you just, I think, hope, like, the idea a lot of times is, you do that work to get yourself in a position where you don't have to work as many hours, because you're in a better position. And then it's sort of like ingrained in the profession that we are there all the time. Our athletes need us they need us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And if we take a day off, or God forbid we're not there when something happens, that makes us feel guilty. And this is just something, I mean, I'm hoping that a lot of young professionals are are recognizing that this is not the appropriate way to do it, because at a certain point, like burnout is, it's so easy to get burned out if you're just working crazy hours all the time, for especially for $30,000 a year.
Right. Yeah, I think that was one. Again, we were kind of talking off air, which we tend to do a lot, which is not great when we're trying to record the episode here. But um, it's really important, when you're looking at this. I think a lot of things around value get shown out there, and what defines value. Is it hours worked? Is it just being there? Is it coverage versus care? And that the two different models there, and what value provided. Is it the amount of treatments and evals and all these different things? And there's a lot of metrics that could go into it. But I think, while it's important to definitely track all that and have a plan on how you want to implement that, you have to make sure that you're getting that support from above, that's going to definitely impact your bottom line, or however that goes. Because what I think I've even found in my career is you keep raising that bar and setting that standard, and that just becomes the new expectation. And unless the compensation or whatever it may be comes along with that, you're in essence just setting a new bar that they are going to expect from you. And you did it in essence for free, because you didn't get a pay raise for it. And that was, something that's hard, and it's hard to stomach. And that's something that I ran into. We didn't travel with our basketball teams at the place that I worked, and team made the NCAA tournament, and we weren't going to travel with them because that is what our policy was. And it was hard to explain that to the person that was covering it, who was a GA at the time. They wanted to go. I understand why they wanted to go. And I didn't feel great about not letting them. But if that was any other job out there, a factory job, and they asked you to go work a full weekend as a reward, but not going to pay you, would you have gone and done it?
No, obviously not. Yeah.
Right. And so that's the hard part about that, is that if you keep setting that and you don't bring it along, your employer, unless they are extremely supportive, which if you find one of those, hold on to that forever, is going to reward you for that in some form or fashion to make it worth your while. Or else I think you really are just spinning your wheels, and you're going to set yourself up for potentially even a harder fall, even though you're doing in what, by your own standards, a higher quality of work.
Right. And the thing is, like, if they're not, super supportive of you, and they don't recognize exactly the value, they're going to be psyched that you just keep doing more and more work for the same amount of money. And then, at the end, what's going to happen is, eventually you're probably going to hit that level of burnout where you hit the threshold where you can't do it anymore. And then you either have to go and say, hey, I'm going to now lower the standard that I've set, or you can pay me more, which a lot of times won't happen. And then, or you can leave. And then what happens there is what you've also done is you've made it even harder for the next person who comes in, because there's this expectation set now. And if someone else comes in and says, well, I'm not doing that amount of work for the amount of money that you're paying me. I don't care what the last person did. Then, you might not last might not last forever, and they'll just keep looking until they find someone that will.
Yeah, hopefully it works out on the better end, that they then realize that, and you make it better for the next person after you, which can happen. But again, you need to have the person that's making that hire and that decision be able to see that.
Right. And like you said, like if you, and that's why, if you have a person that recognizes your value and compensates you appropriately, you're probably not going to leave. Right. So, that's sort of like what I think, what a lot of people are finding is that, like, it just could, like, they worked less because of the pandemic or something like that. And people didn't go into work quite as often, and like things actually didn't fall apart if we weren't there for as many hours as we were there in the past. And I'm hoping that makes us realize that there's a certain threshold where we don't need to be in any more than that, and we can still provide great care as athletic trainers.
Right. Yeah, I think for ATs in leadership positions, again, you are the head AT where you're at. I was where I was at. Um, I would have loved to pay people more money, but that was not in the cards for me to be able to do that. I didn't have control of to that level. But there are certain things you can control. If your budget allows for it, to reward them with something that they've wanted to go and do that you can pay for that they couldn't or didn't want to necessarily, because obviously anytime you can cover something, that's just a little bit easier on them. Is that dues, is it licenses, is it continuing ed stuff, whatever it could be. But you also, I think, one thing you can control is time, to a degree, and encouraging them / forcing them to go away, to take that time when they don't need to be there and give them that support. Because in essence, you are then making them back, in theory, a little bit of money by, increasing their hourly rate in essence, even if they are salaried. And I think that's super important to be able to do those things for people that are in those leadership roles that may not be able to have control over a budget to make it happen the way that you would like to.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think that's sort of maybe one of the one. Well, that's one something I really try and do is, if we don't need someone, if we don't have something going on, I don't expect someone someone on our athletic training staff to just be there in case we have walk-ins. We don't do that. We don't need the AT room open for, you know, 14, 16 hours a day if we don't have practices going on, just in case some athlete decides, hey, I'm just going to pop in and see if I can get some treatment. And that's something that I haven't always been good at. I've in the past I've kind of made poor decisions and like, oh, I'm one of those ATs I was talking about earlier, where like, God forbid something happens, but really, like, what's really going to happen? Like, they don't get a massage from you one time.
Sure.
They don't get an ice bath when they really want one. Like, it's not the end of the world. And so that's why, while we actually have gone up in salary a little bit over it's my fourth year now. And then we obviously we went through a staffing change with the other two members of the staff, and we were able to get a little bit more money for the people that we brought in. But at the same time, it's not, they're not making six figures. So
Right.
I try and do my absolute best to do exactly what you said and increase their hourly wage in a way by letting them go home when they can't, when they don't need to be there.
If one of those opens up and it's making anywhere near six figures, you call me.
Yeah. Come work in Boston.
There you go. My wife works remote, so really it's wherever she wants to end up. But obviously, we don't necessarily have that. Um,
Mhm.
Kind of talking into another point, and this is that we had that I think ties really nicely into this, is providing a service but not being a servant. And I think that's something, excuse me, um, that is so important to remember. And we were athletic training services where I worked. That's what they had initially kind of tabbed it as when there was a change when my position got created there. And so I, looked at that. That's not athletic training servants. And I think that's important. And I've seen a few of those things come around. There was some stuff coming out of the pros on how it's almost like concierge medicine, which I can understand to a point, in that that is a huge business, on so many levels, and hopefully the compensation around that business is also being fair. But then that kind of trickle down, and I understand what people are saying about wanting to provide that high level of care. I get that, but at the same time, contextually, I don't know that I get it. in a
Yeah,
lot of instances, like, it's just, to your point, like, how many bad things truly happen, or if somebody's dealing with a cold, that do they need to text you at 9 o'clock at night to ask about it, or talk about getting with the physician the next day, or whatever the scenario may be, and understanding, like, any other service industry, like when you call the cable guy, what do they tell you? They're going to be there between 12 and 4, and you have
Or
to adjust to that.
if you want them to come out in off hours, that's costing you a pretty penny.
Right. And so you're adjusting to them. And I don't think it is a bad thing that we adjust for the patients that we care for, but it has to have some boundary to it, or else
Mm-hmm.
it just never ends. Because what happens, as we've talked about, if your life circumstances change. When I took my job, I was 27 and single.
Yeah.
Didn't have a lot going on other than a dog, and he slept 20 of the 24 hours a day. Now, if I would have been doing it, I'm married with a 15-month-old. Like, I don't have that ability anymore. So.
Right. And then, talking about that concierge medicine, you say like, hopefully there's a good compensation. I think like, you look at the NFL, from what I've seen, and maybe I'm off base, if you're the director of sports medicine, you get compensated very well. If you are a first year assistant who still has to provide that concierge service, I don't think you're getting concierge medicine money from that.
Sure.
And I also look at it as like, I also want to provide a high level of care. If I don't answer the phone if my athlete tries to call me at 2 a.m. because whatever, they got drunk and fell and have to go to the ER, like, am I providing a lower level of care because I don't want to answer the phone at 2 a.m.? I don't think I am.
I think that's such a hard thing to let go, because you said, again, this athletic trainer guilt in quotes, but there's a lot of good medical practitioners out there in our field and otherwise that it isn't concierge, and yet people come running to them to get stuff done. And I think it's just a mindset of, you provide that service and it's okay for you to set your hours that you are providing that service. And I think being flexible and working with schedules, absolutely. But man, do you have to be able to set it, because I think that shows more of your value, that your time is valuable.
Mm-hmm.
You're really good at your job. It is, and it should be.
Right. And that's why like whenever I see like someone like they put on social media about how they did set those boundaries, and like, I let my coaches know this is when I'm here, and they actually stick to that, I'm super psyched for them.
Absolutely.
Because the other side of that dichotomy is, we've got a lot of ATs who, because they have that guilt, or just because that it's what's expected of them, they have to kind of bend over backwards for their coaches and for their athletes. And I think the problem is, we even see people who are in leadership positions who put out that they love the grind, and like, it's football season, so it's football preseason, and this is what we love to do. And it's like, do we really love to work 100 hours a week? Because I don't, especially like, I'm not getting overtime for that.
And some people do, and I don't hold that against them, and that's great for you. I personally believe I can do a really high level of care and not be there after football meetings to hand out ice to people.
Mm-hmm.
Which I had a coach that was interviewing one time ask, and it's just like, no, I'm not staying 4 hours later than I need to wait for you guys to get done with meetings or come back. For me, it was only a 15-minute drive, and pretty much any time of the day. But I'm not coming back to hand out ice bags. Like, first off, it's not going to help them at all. If you really need them, I'll leave them sitting out for you. But like, that's not making them better. It would be so much better for them to go get that sleep and me see them the next day and spend more time with them, and really hammering that home in that, I think is important.
Yeah. I mean, for the people that do love that, like, 100 hours a week, I think part of the problem there is because, like, as if the young professionals say they love it, it's because they see some of the older ATs do that, and like they see how much. Because, to be honest, like, an athlete, if you're there for them anytime they need something, they're going to be appreciative of that. And I like it when my athletes are appreciative, and I try to be there for them. But what I've learned is, they don't appreciate me any less if I say no to them when they recognize that it's inconvenient.
Sure.
They know, like, hey, like they'll come in and be like, hey, I'm sorry, can I get this? And I'm like, no, I'm sorry, but I don't have time for that, or I'm about to leave. And most of them are just like, all right, I get it. And I'm like, I'll see you tomorrow. And I don't think that just because I didn't, change my plans to give them whatever they wanted, they don't appreciate me any less.
Right. I think that's really important on that relationship that you've built, because you've demonstrated that you are going to do a good job for them, just not at
Mhm.
any point in the day.
Yeah.
Moving on to the next one. This one was kind of framed as, wanting to be autonomous, but also wanting the perks of being part of the coaching staff. And then we were talking again off air, this kind of with versus for mentality. And I was having this conversation a little bit on another episode that'll be coming out around this one. To me, and if you looked at least the organizational chart that I worked in, it wasn't our AD, kind of a second layer, coaches, and then me and my staff. It was AD, kind of coaches. At some point, I kind of technically jumped up over them to a somewhat of a degree, just with the shift in title, but it was on the same level. And that was really kind of an eye-opening thing for me, of like, I don't work for the coaches. Like, yes, to some sense, sure, but I work with the coaches. And to me, that is such an important mindset, with that, and kind of that being autonomy. Like, yeah, you run your department. And again, we were talking about it earlier with, especially secondary ATs, but even with you, how many sports do you guys have?
19.
So you got 19 head coaches, and there's 3 of you.
Mm-hmm.
How is there ever any ability for this, like the thought process of that the same level of time and commitment can be put in by 3 people to match 19? And
Right.
that's even worse in some places, and definitely I got to imagine in a lot of the high school settings, like that you're one person trying to somehow cover 20 plus sports and make it seem like you are fully as committed as everybody on that sport.
Mm-hmm.
And that's quite frankly impossible. And so I think having the ability to separate yourself, that, if the coach has a question, you don't have to go to them. They can come to you. Like, there should be that mutual respect. And I think that's hard, because you get these coaches that have been doing this forever. How many ATs have necessarily been in their role or their place late into their career where that relationship could almost shift? And that was one. It was a D3 localish D3 school that the head AT had been there for so long and seen turnover of almost every sport. And so he would ultimately go into new coach's office, introduce himself, and basically say, I'm so and so, and since I'm probably going to be here longer than you are, here's how we do things.
Right.
And just what a powerful mentality to have. And you don't have to be a jerk about it, but like, what
Right.
a powerful mentality to have, that you aren't bending and molding to them, because you are also a professional in the medical field providing this service, and being good with that. Like,
Right. And and I think as ATs, we definitely want the autonomy, and when we make a medical decision, that's kind of the decision that gets made. And I'm not opposed to working with coaches when it makes sense.
not at all.
If I have a guy that or a female athlete that I'm planning on I'm holding out for something, and I go to the coach and they say, well, what if we do this? And if it makes sense, then I'm absolutely willing to change my mind. But at the end of the day, if I say no, that this is the decision that gets made, I don't that's the decision that gets made. And I think as ATs, we obviously we all want that autonomy. We don't want to be beholden to any of our coaches. Well, I think at the same time, like I'll see on social media people complain that, oh, like all the coaches got this piece of gear and my coach didn't even think about me. And like I appreciate I love getting gear, like, and just as much as anybody else, but you're not part of their staff, so they don't have to spend money on you. And while it's nice when they think about you and they do spend some of their budget and give you a t-shirt or a jacket or whatever, and that happens to me, you can't really get mad when they don't, because you're not part of the football staff. You are not part of the soccer staff. You're part of the athletic training staff. So and so while you can't sit there and be like, well, I want to be my own staff, and then get mad when you don't get the perks of being a member of another staff.
Yeah, I thought about that one time too. I was like, I've never handed out like an AT polo to a coach ever.
Never.
Now, mainly because when their sport is buying it for an AT, it's buying extra polo. If we were going to go and do it, we're buying 20. So the
Right.
pricing difference is slightly skewed there. But I've kind of thought about that too. You got to look at it. You're your own department. You're your own team that is providing this service. And and that was such a light bulb moment for me that I would call coaches out on it when they would say, "Oh, my AT, they're not your AT. They work
Mm-hmm.
with you, but you don't own them because they do not work for you." So when they would call and say, "I need you to come to my office to talk," I would look at the AT and be like, "They can also come over here, and
Mm-hmm.
you don't always have to chase them down if they need something."
Right. And I've had that same situation where I've had, coaches in the past, like, when interviewing or whatever, like they'll say like, oh, I look at the AT as a member of my staff. And
Mm-hmm.
while I appreciate the sentiment, because I
Yes.
think I think most of the time it comes from a place of they're appreciative to have us.
Right.
But you have to kind of check them and say, okay, well, that's nice that you think that, but I just want you to know that we are not part of your staff. And again, not trying to be a jerk, and maybe they'll take offense to it, even though because they didn't mean anything by it. But I do think you have to set that boundary again and say, look, like, I work with you. I work with your student athletes, but
Right.
I don't work for you.
Yeah, so I think all three of those tie in so importantly together, and it's just two very broad things. And if you go one way or the other, you really, it's hard to find a way to have both. You gotta kind of pick the one, but then find the balance of when those things occur. Is kind of the whole point of this discussion. So
Yeah.
the last one that we are kind of combining into two, there is a lot desire for change to happen in the profession. It'll be really interesting how everything kind of unfolds over the next few years. I'm excited for some of the things I've been hearing. We'll have another episode coming out talking about the Career Advancement Committee that has been put into the NATA, which the sounds of it is a phenomenal thing. But some of the ones calling for change, and a lot of people are maybe supporting the ones that maybe don't want to see the change, or at least not saying anything against them. And this isn't meant to be like a fire starting kind of conversation,
Hmm.
but again, you got to find where you land on these things, because it's really hard to have both.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of times, you like in leadership within, whether it's an AT or somewhere else, like, people tend to bring up others that are like them and have similar mindsets. And so, one thing we talk about is we want to increase diversity within the profession. And yet, sometimes we do things that the way I look at it is diametrically opposed to doing that. Like personally, and I've heard other people talk about this on other podcasts, like the change to the masters only, I think is only going to be a detriment to that increase in diversity, because, oftentimes, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who may be able to diversify their profession, they can't go to grad school.
Right.
And it's so you're essentially placing them. And I understand like wanting a master's degree, wanting higher education for the members of our profession, but I think that can cause more headaches that we didn't necessarily consider when that decision was made.
I totally agree with you on that one. It's such a huge and almost like grand experiment. And I remember having these conversations about it, that we were oversaturated with ATs and that this would be potentially a way to kind of bring it back. And I don't know if it just happened that quickly, or if this is, like we kind of talked about earlier, if this is just a little blip. But yes, I can see how that could potentially be a really big detriment to the overall growth of diversity within the profession.
Yeah, I mean, and I remember I was listening to a different podcast that they had on the director of a athletic training education program, and he was opposed to it himself, being in the position where he's oversees that department at a college. And he had a lot of good points, and that was one of his main ones, was like he doesn't see it providing the benefits that people think it's going to provide, and it's only going to provide these barriers for people who otherwise would like to go get a degree and become an athletic trainer.
Sure. Anything else on kind of that topic about advancement, but maybe unwilling to step in where stepping in may be needed?
I mean, I think we do have some amazing advocates out there. And I have some conversations with them regularly, and I think they're working really hard to try and just bring light to issues and point out inconsistencies in the things that we do as a profession, or the things that we believe. And they're oftentimes met with resistance, because people want to maintain that status quo because it might benefit them, or it might be hard for them to discuss whether it's racial injustice or LGBTQ issues, and bringing that up and making that a priority. I think a lot of times people are, it's challenging to discuss, and they think that oftentimes we shouldn't open our mouths and speak to those things.
Yep. It's hard to take the heat when you're the leader and it's all coming at you, but it's also hard in that position to be able to sit back, because if they say something and you reflect on it and maybe it surprises you that maybe you were the focus of what that may have been, even if it wasn't directly called out at you, that can be a scary thing.
Mm-hmm.
But boy, if you can allow yourself to open up to let that sink in, to change you a little bit, or at least make you open to it,
mm-hmm.
That's some pretty powerful stuff.
Right. Because I mean, I think that's all it has to be, is like you being willing to reflect. And if you've said or done something or acted in a certain way in the past, and someone calls you out and they're correct, then you need to sort of course correct. And I think that just makes you better overall.
Agreed. Well, anything else on the dichotomy of the AT that you want to cover that we didn't really touch on?
I think those are the major ones. But I think it's a good kind of starting point.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure that there's other dichotomies that we or others could come up with. But I think it's good to actually have a discussion about it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was just kind of reading back on my general idea for this and just had a couple that in our document, and just,
Mhm.
you're having to try and balance two things, and you have to own up to that in order to make it happen. And that, that ownership bit, which I obviously is a big part of the Jocko, but you have to be willing to check yourself and understand that, going back to the first one, like if you want to get paid more, but you can't just necessarily do that by doing more, like that's a harsh reality. But if it's something you really truly want to change, it might be a reality you have to face. And that's not a bad thing, and can actually be really freeing. And then just, kind of keeping the thing, like it's really hard to rant and rave about one thing or make a very like strong point and then literally go and do the opposite. And I've run across that in my career, and I know I've done that in my career, and I try very hard not to do that now. It's been eye-opening for me, and just looking at, we get a very unique group of patients in our sports med clinic. We, from high school and younger athletes to, we do a lot of ultrasound guided injections for pain, across, I think the oldest one was upper 90s that one of our physicians had done. But you just get a really interesting group, and the more you dig in, or if you dig in so far into their medical record, you get this picture, and you haven't even met them. You have no idea actually why they're there, especially if you've never seen them. And I've already caught myself backing up. You have no idea why they're actually here. Go talk to them, see what fits in the story, then maybe start putting the pieces together. And just being able to check that with all the things you do. And I think that's a hard part about Twitter is, you're making an argument in 280 characters or less. Check on it for a second, and then go and see if you can figure out a way to balance that out.
Right. And I mean, I know when it comes to, mindsets or treatment options or modalities or whatever, people can become so diametrically opposed that they can't even, you shouldn't, I'm never a huge fan of absolutes. I know some other people are like, you will never do this, or you will always do this. And just being able to again step back and see the big picture and say, hey, this thing that people say never works, I bet you I can find a scenario in which it would.
Sure.
And and just not being so in one camp or the other.
Couldn't agree more. Well, I think we'll wrap that up then on the Dichotomy in AT. I need to go personally read the book after I get through a bunch of other ones that I've got in the hopper. But we will link to it. So in case you're interested in it, just check out the episode page. It will be there. And as always, Rick, great talking to you.
Thanks so much, Joe. Always a pleasure.
And hopefully we got some things coming in the future as we brainstorm and have more conversations. So